China deserves our gratitude and respect.
The World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves because they're like the public relations agency for China.
I will praise China again and again.
Praising China for its so-called transparency. I don't think so.
Under the leadership of Dr. Tedros, the World Health Organization played a major role in fighting COVID-19. Its good results are applauded by the international community.
China's cover-up of the Wuhan virus allowed the disease to spread all over the world.
China and the United States could both gain by cooperation or lose by confrontation. Unfortunately, the new coronavirus merely adds to the political virus that is spreading across the United States. This political virus takes every opportunity to denigrate China.
On the 23rd of January 2020, China admitted that a new disease had struck in the city of Wuhan, in the center of the country. The regime decided to impose a lockdown of tens of millions of Chinese, taking away their freedom. They were the first in a long list that over the next few weeks would cross all continents. Yet the same day in Geneva, the Director General of the World Health Organization continued to be reassuring.
Make no mistake, this is, though, an emergency in China. But it has not yet become a global health emergency.
Over several weeks, information coming from China was more worrying every day. The first cases apparently occurred in Wuhan at the end of 2019, near a market where wild animals are sold alive. A new coronavirus could have been transmitted from animals to humans here and claimed its first victims. Doctors receiving the early cases in the Wuhan hospital tried to warn the authorities, but were arrested by the police and accused of being alarmist. It was the Chinese New Year, the country's biggest holiday. And for the regime in Beijing, this was not the time for bad news.
The reflex, the immediate reaction of an authoritative regime is to stifle, to deny, and to avoid risking panic in China itself, not to disturb the other activities concerning the New Year, the great national celebration, when hundreds of millions of people travel. I mean the Chinese ritual of the New Year, that is also a political ritual.
A few days later, on the 27th of January, the streets of the Chinese capital were deserted. The Director General of the WHO was welcomed with great pomp by the Chinese president. The two men considered the situation to be under control.
I personally directed and set up the prevention and control of the epidemic and containment work this time. Through our political decisions, we shall come out of this as the winners of the battle against this epidemic.
This is very, very important, and really we're proud that. And the other important element is the political commitment and your personal leadership, which we have been following.
48 hours later, the WHO's directors were back in Geneva, the headquarters of the organization. The virus had already been confirmed in 15 countries. In Asia and in Europe, people were starting to worry and criticize the attitude of the head of the organization, who still refused to declare an international emergency.
The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words. So is China's commitment to transparency and to supporting other countries. In many ways, China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response, and it's not an exaggeration. And WHO doesn't recommend and actually opposes any restrictions for travel and trade or other measures against China.
It's clear that right from the start, the World Health Organization stumbled and stuttered. There were delays in communications between China and the WHO, and in the acknowledgement by the WHO of the fact of the human-to-human transmission of this virus. And that was certainly a pity, because the loss of a week or 10 days' time was already considerable.
The Chinese didn't tell it all at the start. After 2 or 3 weeks, at a given moment, it became impossible to keep quiet. And we saw the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, say, "There is no outbreak of an international disease." That's when people said, "But why doesn't he say it?" But to understand all that, you have to understand that the WHO has what is called an executive board that is made up of some 30 countries, and we succumb to the UN disease, which is the unanimity disease. You realize what the weight of China on the executive board means today. How can one actually get the Chinese ambassador who represents his country to accept responsibility and say, "Yes, that started with us, and we are spreading this worldwide epidemic"? The answer is you can't.
On the 31st of January, Donald Trump closed the borders to the Chinese and all those coming from China. Because the WHO failed to make a decision, the American president decided to act unilaterally. Yet on that day, America didn't have a single case. But this was the start of a long verbal escalation by President Trump. From then on, he targeted Beijing and the WHO in each of his declarations.
We're not happy about China, I will tell you that. The ink wasn't dry on a great trade deal, and all of a sudden, the plague comes in from China. We're not happy about it. They could have stopped it. They are a very brilliant nation, scientifically and otherwise. It got loose, let's say, and they could have capped it. They could have stopped it. Don't close your borders to China, don't do this, they don't report what's really going on. They didn't see it, and yet they were there. They didn't see what was going on in Wuhan. They didn't see it. How do you not see it?
Finally, at the end of May, the Trump administration decided to leave the WHO definitively because, in his opinion, it was doubly at fault. Firstly, for the delay in declaring an international emergency, then the pandemic, and then for too much deference to China.
The world is now suffering as a result of the malfeasance of the Chinese government. China's cover-up of the Wuhan virus allowed the disease to spread all over the world, instigating a global pandemic that has cost more than 100,000 American lives and over 1 million lives worldwide. Chinese officials ignored their reporting obligations to the World Health Organization and pressured the World Health Organization to mislead the world when the virus was first discovered by Chinese authorities.
The United States, however, is still groundlessly heaping blame on China and the World Health Organization, attempting to shift the focus of the American public to cover its inefficiency in epidemic response, which is quite immoral and can only deceive the world.
It is difficult for the WHO to avoid this criticism because it was certainly late in taking active measures at the start of the epidemic. But the UN, the WHO, and every other international organization is made up of its member countries. So it needs the voluntary support and close cooperation by all the member countries for the WHO to function correctly. I think it is very regrettable that this has become a political battle.
I do not put the United States and China on the same level. We do not share the same history. We do not have the same values, the same approach to freedom. But finally, there they are, the first and second powers, and now face to face. Neither their extreme conflicts nor their association are in our interest. So the European path consists of defending our values, the strength of our model, and precisely to understand that the multilateral forums are those that best protect us. I would further argue that they allow us to carry these values internationally.
180 kilometers from the coast of China is the island of Taiwan, one of the most modern and developed countries in Asia. Beijing has claimed the territory since 1949, but its independence is in fact supported and defended by the United States. Since the recognition of mainland China by the UN, Taiwan has been isolated, practically excluded from the international community. Under pressure from China, the WHO refuses to communicate with its government. Even in the case of the epidemic directly threatening the Taiwanese, communication is forbidden.
Taiwan is a part of China. There is only one China, not two. And there is not one China plus one Taiwan. Now, every international organization, including the WHO and the United Nations, every country except for about 20, all admit that the People's Republic of China is the only legal member, their only partner, which means they all agree with one China policy. This is a basic principle. Only if Taiwan agrees with this principle will it be able to become an observer of the WHO without any problem.
Paradoxically, this exclusion from the WHO has allowed Taiwan to be perhaps the country that has best dealt with this epidemic. The Taiwanese were obliged to develop their own warning system, their own procedures, alone in the world. From the month of December 2019, while the WHO totally ignored the Chinese situation, the Taiwan government had already begun to protect its population.
17 years ago, SARS greatly affected and traumatized the Taiwanese, physically, mentally, and economically. Since then, we've been trying to take the maximum precautions possible regarding epidemic problems. In fact, by mid-December, we had already received information about the deaths in Wuhan from an unknown disease. Since that moment, we have taken precautions to protect ourselves from a potential epidemic.
Despite its proximity to and exchanges with China, Taiwan, among the first countries affected, has had fewer than 10 deaths since the start of the pandemic. An incredible result for a country that is excluded from cooperation by the World Health Organization. In April, a journalist from Hong Kong decided to interview an executive from the WHO about the situation in Taiwan.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership?
The deputy director of the WHO complained of a problem with the line before hanging up.
Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
When the journalist called again, he quite simply refused to pronounce the name Taiwan.
And I just want to see if you can comment a bit on how Taiwan has done so far in terms of containing the virus.
Well, we've already talked about China, and when you look across all the different areas of China, they've actually all done quite a good job. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting us to participate.
Taiwan is a free and democratic country. We can elect our president. We have a totally different political system from China. On becoming a member of the World Health Organization, we hope to have access to essential information. We could also share our experience in dealing with the epidemic with the whole world.
The Taiwan paradox is cruel for the WHO. The country that best defended itself from the virus is the one that has no connection with the organization, a prisoner of the geopolitical confrontation between China and the United States. When the WHO was set up, the founders thought they were sheltered from global conflict. On the 24th of July 1948, after the Second World War and the creation of the UN, 55 nations combined to give birth to the World Health Organization in Geneva.
The suffering of millions of human beings in scores of countries will be alleviated, and many, many thousands of lives will be saved.
The choice of Switzerland was no accident. It was a neutral country that left political questions aside.
That is what the Founding Fathers wished for in 1948, when they set the headquarters of the WHO in Geneva, to some extent, to keep it apart from New York, the headquarters of the political United Nations.
Before the war, the League of Nations had also tried to promote international cooperation in the matter of health, especially after the Spanish flu between 1918 and 1920, but without attaining the same objectives of the newly formed WHO.
When the WHO was created in the immediate post-World War II period, it began with very great idealism and aspiration. And there were some from whatever country who believed truly in an international order, United Nations and its various agencies that would make the world safe for peace so that we would never see devastation like World War II again. That was the aspiration.
But the Cold War between the United States and the USSR already affected all international relations. In 1949, Stalin withdrew the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc from the WHO.
Presque tous les pays du monde, à l'exception de l'URSS et de ses satellites, se sont groupés afin d'assurer une plus active participation à la grande tâche de veiller sur la santé publique.
Beyond the rivalry between the two giants, two conceptions of health clashed. One tied to capitalism and one that wished for health to be nationalized. After the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev entered into a pacific coexistence with America. In 1955, he decided that the Soviet Union should return to the fold.
That created a moment, an oasis in world history, which allowed the WHO to step onto that stage, and it seized that opportunity with one of its greatest accomplishments, if not its greatest accomplishment, which was the campaign to eradicate smallpox worldwide.
While the two blocs threatened each other in Berlin or Cuba, they worked hand in hand inside the WHO.
My first international activity was working with the smallpox eradication for 2 years. During that program, I worked in India side by side with people from the USSR, from many different countries around the world, and we all worked together technically to accomplish a common goal. While the politics continued to inflame international ideas and international views, the technical people worked perfectly together and eradicated a disease that was causing 2.7 million deaths in 1967 alone.
At the end of the 1970s, the World Health Organization announced the eradication of smallpox.
As I am concerned, I believe surely that it is the last case in the world.
Thus, in the 1970s, the WHO conquered one of the most deadly viruses and generalized the use of antibiotics. Membership of the organization went from 55 to 150 states. And under the impetus of these newly joined southern countries, the WHO decided to be even more ambitious. Meeting in 1978 at Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, one of the Soviet republics, the WHO declared that it was no longer just an agency for cooperation about disease, but that it had become a guarantor of health for all, for everyone, everywhere, and at all levels.
There was a great international conference in which the Declaration of Alma-Ata declared that the social determinants of health must be addressed. Health policy must be formulated in an intersectoral way. All the sectors of the country and economy have to be brought to bear on it. And the goal should be universal equity. Health for all by the year 2000 was the glorious, if naive, dream of the Alma-Ata Declaration.
But what should have been the launchpad for a new ambition soon turned into a fiasco. And Alma-Ata marked the beginning of a takeover of the organization by the specific interests of member states.
That was extremely threatening, obviously, to the powerful nations, because the powerful nations don't really want an equal or a fair international economic order. It goes against their interests. And so that project was abandoned very, very fast.
Many countries in the global north, the United Kingdom, especially when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, the United States, especially when Ronald Reagan became president, became very conservative, didn't like the fact that these countries, former colonies from the global south, were now becoming numerically dominant in the World Health Assembly.
This political divide between the rich and the developing countries still exists. Today it marks the boundary between the American and Chinese allies in the WHO. And at the end of the 1970s, it was to have important consequences on the institution when a new world epidemic appeared, HIV.
In 1979, at a time when some hundreds, some dozens of cases were described in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, then in New York, there were already hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people infected in Africa.
I mean, the HIV crisis was not the same everywhere. Some countries had much, much higher infection rates, particularly at the southern part of Africa, for example, even worse than the northern part of Africa, for example. So there were, I don't know, maybe 30 million people that didn't have access to HIV drugs at the time in developing countries and really had no hope of getting access to them, and they were all going to die.
The WHO dithered and wasted time. It seemed to be incapable of taking the measure of what was starting to be a pandemic, as well as a moral and political problem all over the world.
At one and the same time, there was a climate that was not a climate of global attention to the subject of the infection. And there was an indecisive person at the head of the organization. There were already member states that did not particularly support the organization, and also there was much uncertainty about the disease. And the world, when it realized what was happening, got its act together and said, "This is a global pandemic. The virus has no bounds. We are not reacting to this global epidemic with a global response." That's why they created a special United Nations program with its own secretariat, UN AIDS, that combined 11 of some of the most important United Nations agencies.
So the United Nations took full control of the AIDS issue. This was a first for the international community.
I can see why UNAIDS was set up at the time to deal specifically with one disease, but there were a number of problems that emerged from the setting up of a single UN organization to deal with just one disease. It had side effects that affected health systems in many countries, that resulted in the neglect of other important health issues. So, you know, when UNAIDS was established, it resolved certain problems, but at the same time, it created new problems as well.
I would also like to say that this pandemic is not over. In spite of all the progress made, AIDS continues to kill 700 to 800,000 people annually across the world.
By the end of the 1990s, the WHO had lost its monopoly for managing health crises. Essentially, this was due to its weak leadership. But faced with ever-increasing challenges, the organization suffered from its small size. In 2020, its budget was near to 5 billion euros. An impressive sum, but in fact, that is the budget for a single large French hospital complex.
Well, clearly the budget of the World Health Organization is very small compared to budgets even in cities, in big cities, as far as public health goes. So WHO doesn't have a budget which permits it to do what it could be doing. And so every time there's an emergency, it has to go out and raise more funds in order to respond to that emergency.
Ronald Reagan, the American president in the 1980s, was the first to understand that this low budget gave him political power over the organization.
Thank President Mitterrand.
Unhappy to see the balance tip towards developing countries, he decided, before Donald Trump, to limit the United States' financial contribution.
The United States and other countries of the global north were losing control of the policies and agenda of the WHO, and so they began to act in very punitive ways towards the WHO. An effort led by the United States in 1980 froze the budget, and the Reagan administration actually cut its contribution to 20% of its assessed dues. So dues were frozen first, which in a world of inflation and growth of additional expenses meant essentially an effective decrease of the budget, and they were gutted. Their health capacity, their medical system capacity, their surveillance capacity were really decimated.
To increase its resources, the WHO began to diversify its sources of income. The obligatory contributions from member states only represent 20% of its budget. The rest comes from voluntary contributions, donations, mainly from member states, like the $2 billion that China has just pledged, but also from private institutions. And that has an impact on the functioning of the WHO.
An example of the way in which private philanthropy can distort the agenda of WHO, in my view, is, for example, with polio eradication. Now, I'm all for polio eradication, but only if it is done in a way that doesn't undermine other programs that may be much more important. And currently, we have large amounts of WHO's budget being directed at polio eradication, which has a very small burden of disease across the world. And it's really a vanity project for the Gates Foundation.
Years ago, in starting Microsoft, we had a very ambitious vision, a computer for everyone. Now I join you in seeking to achieve an even more important vision, which is good health for every human being.
The second financier of the WHO is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which means that if one day Mr. Gates says, I will donate a sum of money, but I would prefer it to go towards a vaccine against poliomyelitis, then that's that. So today, the Director General of the WHO gives him the money. Countries give him money on the condition that it is for a particular program. That's no good.
To satisfy its donors, the WHO multiplies its publicity campaigns for sexual health or against smoking. But it is more difficult for it to adapt to the threat of minor epidemics. Yet, at the start of the century, the world was beginning to change. The emergence of China gave a new dimension to globalization. The most populous country in the world is changing at a pace never before seen in modern history. A rural and peasant empire is becoming an urban and industrial giant. Such changes create a new viral dynamic when live animal markets are set up in the middle of mega cities. At the end of 2002, an animal coronavirus broke the species barrier in the city of Foshan in southern China. It was the start of an atypical pneumonia epidemic that spread silently across the country. The rest of the world learned about it only when victims fell ill in Hong Kong.
I'm worried in case I get infected by my classmates.
The disease is not under control. As a responsible citizen, you should do something to safeguard your health.
At 8 o'clock, the train compartment is too crowded and the air quality is bad. It's safer to wear a mask.
While the world began to be infected by what became known as SARS, China continued to deny its existence.
They said this is nothing that's serious. It was an infection. We know what it was. We've stopped it. It's not spreading any further. And so WHO went on for about a week as it learned more about this disease spreading around the world. And then the Director General took a brave and courageous move to report globally that China was putting the rest of the world at risk by not reporting what was going on in China.
Help identify this new disease and stop.
Gro Harlem Brundtland, the WHO's Director General, chose David Heyman, its chief epidemiologist, to lead the charge.
We knew that we needed to make a global alert so that other countries could be aware of this.
In Beijing, the roads are deserted. Everyone is wearing a mask, but the regime didn't expect to be blamed. David Heyman became more insistent, even in New York at the United Nations.
Dr. Heyman. We hope that this will set a precedent in China because infectious diseases know no borders. An infectious disease in one country today, when there's rapid transport around the world, is an infectious disease problem for any country.
Faced with the determination of the WHO, Beijing decided to recant. The Minister of Health was sacked, and the regime began to share its information. The Director General of the WHO had won the showdown.
Dr. Brundtland was a former head of state, and in addition, she was a pediatrician. She understood clearly politics as well as technical issues related to health. Other Director Generals were less willing to take a political stand than she was. She was a very strong Director General who didn't wait for consensus from countries before acting. She acted and then brought countries along with her in order that they would agree with what she did.
It was enormously effective in what the WHO was able to provide leadership for. Over the reluctant consent of China, China was offended, was upset, was insulted, and this will come back to haunt the WHO and the world to this day.
Three years later, when the SARS coronavirus had completely disappeared, the WHO chose a new Director General. Margaret Chan, previously responsible for health in Hong Kong, who became prominent during the health crisis, took over as head of the organization.
I would like to thank my country for nominating me to this post. And also I would like to thank the Hong Kong and Macau Special Administrative Region governments, alongside with the central government, provided me with a lot of support during the 3 months of a campaign trail.
With Margaret Chan, Beijing declared its intentions. The WHO was a prime objective in its international strategy.
her. She was a Chinese national. She had the Chinese support, and the Chinese could imagine that she would be cooperative and compliant in the sense they were very unhappy with the way Brundtland had handled matters, and to some extent that may have been proven true.
Yet the new Director General had a novel and extremely powerful instrument available to her to reinforce her independence. In 2005, the member states of the WHO voted for what they called the International Health Regulations.
It authorized the WHO to issue alerts about health phenomena, serious health problems that might occur. It even authorized it to publicly denounce failings of states, delays or denials, lateness in reacting or the denial of these phenomena. But on the other hand, the WHO is part of the system of the United States whose fundamental rule is non-interference. And so on the one hand, the WHO is told to interfere with the political business of states because all epidemics are political phenomena. At the same time, it's told don't interfere with the political affairs of states.
Look what happened at the World Trade Organization. At the WTO, when a country is out of line, it is immediately brought to order by the WTO Director General and by his colleagues. And if it is still not following the right course, it can leave the WTO. But quitting the WTO is a dramatic move for a country. So, what people have accepted for the economy, for capitalism, for trade, they are incapable of doing the same for human health. And that is tragic.
Steadily over 40 years, the WHO, in common with any institution serving the public interest, has been weakened. This is not some kind of unfortunate mistake. It is wanted. They do not want a strong WHO. They want a World Health Organization that will serve the fact that health is a $1 trillion market.
Limited budgets, weak government. It was in 2014 in West Africa that the WHO's bad habits gave rise to the most dramatic consequences. In Liberia, Sierra Leone, and in Guinea, there were multiple outbreaks of Ebola. In the field, teams from Doctors Without Borders watched as the wave advanced without any international political response. In March, they decided to raise the alarm.
We're facing an epidemic of a hitherto unseen type, with growth that we have never seen in the number of cases in the territory.
A few days later, in Geneva, the WHO estimated that this did not constitute an international danger.
WHO does not recommend any travel and trade restrictions. They don't make public health sense.
The WHO took months to react while the virus was rocketing up. Deaths from Ebola had been at 60%. And the WHO seemed to be looking elsewhere in spite of the pleas that NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders had launched. So, while the epidemic spread amongst the most populous areas, with a large number of fatalities, the WHO did not react.
L'OMS n'a pas réagi.
Action finally came on the 8th of August 2014, 6 months after the start of the epidemic. Ebola had contaminated more than 2,000 victims before the director of the WHO finally reacted.
This morning, I am declaring the current outbreak of Ebola virus disease a public health emergency of international concern.
By the time the epidemic was finally declared over in 2016, it had caused 10,000 deaths in a dozen West African countries. Once more, the WHO prepared to change its Director General.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to say
Philippe Douste-Blazy, former French Minister of Health and Deputy General Secretary of the UN, presented his candidature.
To present my candidacy for the post of Director General of the World Health Organization.
A few months earlier, he had been in Beijing seeking Chinese support for his election. Alas, the Chinese president told him that he had chosen the African candidate, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
When China decides today to help a candidate, he obviously has a much better chance because the number of countries with aid from China can be included. They can be asked to vote for a candidate, but that's a typical election, unfortunately. That's how it is. Up until now, we can't say there is anything better than democracy.
Dr. Tedros was elected and was the first African to become Director General of the WHO. The Ethiopian was not unknown. He had been Minister of Health and Foreign Affairs in his country for some 15 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
I was the director of the Global Fund when he was Minister of Health in Ethiopia. I worked a lot with him. He had also been the president of the board of the Global Fund. He had carried out some remarkable health reforms in Ethiopia. So in the eyes of the Africans, particularly, before his election, he had legitimacy as a reformer in health and primary health care.
Dr. Tedros, I would consider one of the very best ministers of health ever in Africa, and I am not alone in believing that. Many, many other people believe that as well. He spent a decade expanding the number of hospitals, improving the management capacity of the hospitals, improving the quality of care, creating a health workforce that was the sort of health extension worker, so every single person could get access to care in a very, very poor country.
But there was another facet to the new director of the WHO. For 15 years, he had been a minister in the authoritarian Ethiopian regime, responsible for the death of hundreds of political opponents. When he was Minister of Health, he had several times refused to recognize epidemics in the country to avoid putting off investors.
Teams from Doctors Without Borders reported several cases of cholera, an epidemic, while the Minister of Health at the time said no. There are cases of acute watery diarrhea. It wasn't cholera. He threatened to expel the Doctors Without Borders if, as he put it, they blabbed about a current epidemic of cholera.
A few days after taking over as head of the organization, Dr. Tedros appointed Robert Mugabe, the former dictator of Zimbabwe, as ambassador to the WHO.
Robert Mugabe's appointment to the WHO as a WHO ambassador, quite frankly, I thought it was a bad April Fool's joke. It is absolutely unacceptable, absolutely inconceivable that this individual would have a role as a goodwill ambassador for any organization, much less the World Health Organization.
Faced with an international outcry, Dr. Tedros was obliged to recant. But his message was clear. Health is a political matter, and politics is built with allies.
He's someone who was elected by a coalition of countries driven by China, southern countries and African countries. It's the logical end of Western domination of the technically important organization, the UN. Paradoxically, it's still the West that very, very largely finances the World Health Organization, but has absolutely no control over its political functioning, except for the assembly of member states.
The World Health Organization is under a strain that didn't start with COVID-19, but that we've seen coming for several years through the tension between China and the United States of America. And multilateralism must not be the victim of this tension. Firstly, because that would be a backward step in terms of international cooperation, knowledge, the capacity to organize ourselves. And then because there would be no sense in it. And finally, because we Europeans and we French, we would be the victims.
At the head of international organizations, European or American candidates are already victims of Chinese strategy. From now on, Beijing will mobilize all its allies to elect its candidates. Sometimes they come from friendly countries like Dr. Tedros, sometimes directly from functionaries from the regime in Beijing.
Mr. Chu Dongyu, China.
The Chinese Chu Dongyu was elected in 2019 to head the FAO, the United Nations agency that fights against world famine, a post that is just as strategic as the WHO. In 2016, Meng Hongwei, responsible for state security in Beijing, was elected to head Interpol, the International Police Cooperation Department based in Lyon. A very controversial election, given the role of the police in China under political repression. In 2018, the Chinese director of Interpol disappeared overnight, deposed by Beijing, which accused him of corruption, without informing its partners in the international agency. Today, representatives of the Chinese government also head the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, where the very strategic norms for 5G are discussed. And a Chinese man directs the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. And finally, the Chinese are to play a key role in the UN Human Rights Council, also based in Geneva.
It's the law of order.
The population of China exceeds 1/5 of the whole world, and economic aggregate, manufacturing industry and trading business of China always ranked the first or the second in the world. There are more Chinese citizens going into big international organizations and becoming leaders. This trend is inevitable. No one can stop this. China is not going to accept any kind of insults, discrimination, or unequal treatments on our country and people. It's not acceptable to slander and start rumors about China.
Firstly, China has a strategy that consists of building its own intrinsic balances. And it needs the world on the economic plan to maintain its internal balances for production, stability, for the enrichment of its middle class. And for some years now, it wants to be part of the international order that we have established. What's at stake for us is to know if China, joining the international order, will change to correspond to these universal values and to what has been possible for us for more than 70 years to live and ensure stability, or if China will change it.
But if China today can push its candidates into international organizations, that is also due to the desertion of the United States. Trump's America does not believe in multilateralism. Its criticism mixes up the WHO with other organizations when they no longer align themselves with American positions.
They consider China a developing nation, and because China's a developing nation, they take massive advantage of the United States. Why didn't other presidents stop this? I've been talking about it from the day I got in, and we're looking at that very, very strongly. World trade, So I have a problem with world health and world trade, both of them. I'm not sure which is worse, you want to know the truth, but we'll figure it out, okay?
Today, the United States, that still plays the prime role in the heart of the UN, has moved away from a great many international organizations that are both special and very important. For example, the UN Human Rights Council from UNESCO, the Vienna Agreement on the Iranian nuclear program, and also the Paris Agreement.
On the one side, you have China, that acts inside the United Nations, not to create a program or a new action, but to gain legitimacy, to protect itself defensively, mainly to avoid anything that goes against its own particular interests. That's not new. Other countries do the same thing. But given the size of China, and scope and sometimes the aberrant aspect of the interests they protect, it's more serious. And they're faced with the United States, whose #1 reflex is to say that as we don't like the way the instrument works, we'll break it.
The World Health Organization is a victim of the confrontation between China and the United States. It is also a victim of the emotion engendered by the largest pandemic of the century. The majority of human beings went into isolation. Everyone knew fear, anger, and then hope. It will take more than commissions of inquiry to know if it could have been handled better.
The great pandemics we learned from the history of humanity always end in looking for the culprit. Always. And the culprit is named. And at a time when the mindset, the ill wind that blows across the current world, is rather for nationalism, a distant international organization is picked out to take the blame. Because it's awkward to lay it on a powerful colleague, because we are always quick to blind ourselves to our own frailties. I think that would be deeply unjust.
Unfortunately, in the 21st century, our multilateralism is in danger. Each country considers that its sole and unique priority is to look after itself. Each country, in particular the United States, with its America first, and it is dangerous to think like that.
So how can the institution be reformed so that it rediscovers the efficacy in the struggle against epidemics? So that it can overcome the rivalry between China and the USA?
I don't think that we have to create a different structure to respond to emergency health situations, because it will end with the same failings as the others. I don't think we should undermine the WHO as Trump has done by depriving it of part of its budget, nor by creating rival structures that are bound to run up against the WHO, certainly not giving the same service. I think we have to get the states concerned to engage in respecting the rules that they themselves drew up.
Hopefully, our political leaders will have learned the lesson. But you know, sometimes they don't learn. And that's the misfortune. So let's hope that our political leaders now have clearly understood the importance of being prepared for the next pandemic should it come.
The coronavirus crisis will certainly have served as a warning. Both because other pandemics are not only possible but probable, a major issue for humanity. But also because the world health system is fragile and poorly armed to face up to one. But to prepare for that, we have to overcome the global disorder of our time, of which the WHO crisis is the symptom and not the cause.